G'day, welcome to the Digger History Podcast. My name's Keith Robinson, and in this episode I'll be talking about the anniversary of the Royal Australian Air Force. 1st of March is the day that the Royal Australian Air Force acknowledge as their anniversary. This year, 2025, the RAAF will be celebrating its 104th anniversary. Puts the RAAF a whole 20 years younger than its older siblings, the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Navy. If you listen back to my podcast number 1 on the anniversary of the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Navy, they celebrate their anniversary as the 1st of March 1901, a whole 2 months after the Australian Federation. Like the Army and the Navy that inherited their forces from the states that federated to form Australia, there was no pre-existing air forces in any of the states when Australia became a federation in 1901. In fact, there were actually no real air forces in 1901. The military aviation wasn't really a thing at that point in history. I mean, there had been a couple of balloons used in warfare before that, but mainstream air forces had not become a thing back then. When the states formed the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, Australia had 2 branches of armed services, the Army and the Navy, and that remained like that for another 10 years. So in 1911 there was an Imperial Conference in London, and it was decided that the British Empire should include aviation as part of the armed forces. And Australia, they kind of jumped on that bandwagon and formed the Australian Flying Corps. Now, I do say Australian Flying Corps, but it went through several different name changes over a couple of years, and the AFC, or Australian Flying Corps, seems to be the one that stuck. So in 1911, not long after this conference in London, the Army started advertising for pilots and mechanics. So the AFC was part of the Army back then. It wasn't at this stage its own branch of the armed forces, but yeah, another corps of the Army. So in 1912, the Australian Flying Corps started selecting its men and ordering its first aircraft. And the first aircraft it ordered it ordered 2 single seat monoplanes and 2 2-seater biplanes. These aircraft, interestingly enough, were called, the type of aircraft they were called were tractor planes. I had to look up what that meant. So a tractor plane, so there were 2 different main motor configurations with aircraft back then. There was the aircraft with the propeller at the front, which would pull the aircraft along, and then there were ones with the propeller at the rear that would push the aircraft along. So the ones with the propeller at the front, they were the tractor planes. So initial order of 4 aircraft, 2 biplanes and 2 monoplanes. Now, apologies to interrupt here. I just had to change my microphone. So I've got a new microphone that seems to keep cutting out the recording. I'm not sure why. So I've changed back to my old microphone, so apologies if the volume has changed drastically, But yeah, I'll work out these tech issues and figure out this new microphone later on. I'll just plug back in my old one to continue on with this podcast. So yeah, where was I? Yep, the 4 tractor planes ordered for the initial order, 2 biplanes, 2 monoplanes, and then on the 2nd of March 1913, the Central Flying School was formed to raise the first squadron and to train pilots. Now the Central Flying School was originally going to be in Duntroon, but then it was changed to Point Cook in Victoria, where it still remains today as one of the main training schools for the Air Force. So when World War One broke out, the RAAF was formed to send soldiers overseas, and the Australian Flying Corps was part of that. So the first I guess you could call it action was one aircraft was sent to assist in occupying German colonies in New Guinea. But by the time the aircraft had actually been unpacked from its crate, the Germans had already surrendered. So there was no actual action seen at this stage. But moving forward in World War One, the AFC saw action in Mesopotamia, which is like in Iraq, modern day Iraq, in Palestine, and in France. Now I'm not going to go into detail in the battles of the Australian Flying Corps and where they served and the types of aircraft, because that's kind of another podcast in itself, and this podcast is actually about the formation of the Royal Australian Air Force. So I'll just briefly go through the pre RAAF, and just as a quick bit of a highlight of what came before the Royal Australian Air Force. So by the end of World War One, four squadrons of the AFC had served in the war, and they'd served alongside the Royal Flying Corps, which is the British version of the Australian Flying Corps. But essentially they were under the command of the army, as they were part of the AIF. So they were attached to Australian and British ground forces, and quite often under the command of those ground forces. Now, as well as 4 operational squadrons that served in the First World War, the AFC also had 4 training squadrons. And these squadrons were formed in the UK and designated the First Training Wing. Now, throughout the war, about 3,500 men served with AFC, and of them 410 were pilots and 153 were observers. Now, on top of that, about 200 Australians served with the Royal Navy Air Service, and of them Australian flying pioneers Charles Kingswood Smith and Bert Hinkler were amongst those that served with the RNAS. Now, after the war, the AIF was disbanded in 1919, and as the AFC was part of the AIF, it too was disbanded. But then the Australian Air Corps was founded and briefly existed for about a year before the formation of the Australian Air Force. So on the 31st of March 1921, the Australian Air Force was formed, and briefly was called the Australian Air Force until on the 13th of August that same year, the the royal prefix was approved by the King, and it then became known as the RAAF, or the Royal Australian Air Force. And just a couple of interesting points there. So the RAAF is the second oldest independent air force in the world, second only to the Royal Air Force. The Royal Air Force was formed in April 1918, so it's older than the RAAF by a few years. So what I mean by independent air force is it's not under the control of one of the other armed forces. For example, the AFC was actually part of the army at the time, but the RAAF, when it was formed, it was its own independent service, thus forming three armed services for Australia. The other interesting point is when the RAAF was formed, it actually had more aircraft than personnel. It had less than 150 personnel, and it had 170 aircraft. So yeah, that's quite interesting. More aircraft than personnel. So there you go. That's the come to the end of the podcast, and a brief story of the formation of the RAAF. I find it quite interesting. I'll probably do a few more podcasts on the RAAF history and some of the actions it was involved with, and some of the aircraft. I'm quite interested in the Air Force. My grandfather served in the RAAF in World War II. He flew Wellington bombers with Bomber Command, and then was posted to Ferry Command, ferrying aircraft out of North America into Britain, which is not a very well known part of the Air Force, but it's quite an interesting story. So that's another podcast for later on about Ferry Command. So many thanks for listening to the podcast. Once again, I do apologise for the technical mishap halfway through the podcast. I got this fancy new microphone, but I'm not sure if it's something I was doing, but it seemed to cut off quite frequently, and I'm not sure, but I'll figure that out. So thanks again for listening. Comment, subscribe, like, do all that kind of stuff that they tell you to do on these podcasts. If you got anything that you'd like me to do a podcast on, please pop it in the comments, because I'd love to hear from you. And even if it's something I'm not too familiar about, I'll do some research, because that's part of the fun of doing this podcast is researching these things. I've got another podcast another episode I'm working on. It's about the Australian involvement in the Western Front, and it's quite a big one. There's a lot of research and things, so I'm actually recording it in stages. I'm going to put together, so it's a bigger project. So I'm hoping to have that one out pretty soon. So thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you guys next time.